Apreciados amigos y amigas, qué alegría que estemos todos juntos aquí en la Iglesia de Todos los Santos. Dear friends, what a joy it is that we are all here together at All Saints Church. Again, wish we could be together in person, and grateful that we're together in this way, particularly because so big a part of this community increasingly is folks who are outside the Pasadena area. And so however you have found yourself into the orbit of All Saints Church, so glad that you're with us this morning. Truly excited about the Rector's Forum that we have. Before we get to that, as always, our Sunday food table has been active. Thanks to Erica, Bob, Corey, and Corazon, who came out and gave away 55 lunches. So thank you for all your work. Since the pandemic started, we have also identified every week what we're calling a partner in love. A Partner in Love is a local organization that is doing incredible work that we really encourage everyone to support financially as much as you can during this pandemic, so that as we come out of this, the foundational organizations that provide such key services to our community are as strong as they can be. And so our Partner in Love this week is Planned Parenthood of Pasadena and San Gabriel Valley. On this Mother's Day, it is incredibly important that we support this critical community provider of maternal health care. Planned Parenthood provides primary safety net health care for many of the most vulnerable people in our community. And so in the Facebook link and on our live stream page, there's a link to click to give. Make sure you select Planned Parenthood of Pasadena and San Gabriel Valley and give as much as you are able. So I want to jump right into our forum this morning. Over the past several months, we've been talking a lot about telling the whole story here at All Saints Church. The language we're using comes from Bishop Jennifer Baskerville-Burrows, who visited us right before the pandemic began last year. And Jennifer talks about how we need to tell the whole story together so that we can write a new story together. In the language of our sacrament of reconciliation, we've got to start with self-examination. We take a deep look at our own history. We listen deeply to how that history has impacted everyone, particularly the most vulnerable and marginalized among us. We have to tell the whole story. And then we can look at the story and say, is there reparative work that needs to be done? Are there wounds that need healing? And what does it mean to come together and do that? And then how do we move forward and write a new story together? So here at All Saints, we're dipping our toes in this water by forming two telling the whole story groups. One which is looking at the stained glass windows in our church, and the other one which is looking at the land that we currently occupy. What does it mean to tell the whole story about those two things? We are blessed that a member of each of these groups, Bill Deverell and Becky Nicolaitis, are also part of a larger civic effort to do much of the same thing. In late 2019, Mayor Garcetti called together what he called a civic memory working group. This was 40 historians, indigenous elders, and other civic cultural leaders, curators, architects, artists, scholars, designers. And its main charge as it worked across 2020 and into this year was to produce a series of recommendations to help Los Angeles, and I love this language, so long enthralled to its reputation as a city of the future, engage more productively and honestly with its past, with our past, especially where that past is fraught or has been buried or whitewashed. The working group's report, which includes a print volume and a website, and the link of that website is going to go in the chat and on Facebook. It was released last month, and there were 18 key recommendations, subcommittee reports, essays, photo essays, interviews, and roundtable discussions on significant topics. I really encourage you to go to the website and just lose yourself in it. It is incredible. And again, you can access that all at civicmemory.la. That's the website. Today, we're joined by Bill, by Becky, and two other members of the working group, Christopher Hawthorne and Gail Kennard. And they're going to walk us through the work they did and how they did it, and dream with us about what this can mean for Los Angeles, and maybe even have some conversations about what we can learn for our own effort at All Saints Church. So now I'm going to turn it over to Bill Deverell. And Bill, why don't you just take it from here?
Happy to do so, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us. Mike, thank you so much for the invitation to have my friends and colleagues join you all today. this work on the Civic Memory Working Group and the report and recommendations that followed has been, frankly, in my professional career, entirely unique and kind of an exceptional experience to be involved with such a talented group of people who are committed to doing exactly what you just talked about, sort of grappling with the hurts and heartaches of our histories and thinking about commemoration and memorialization in new ways. And we're really thrilled by the collective work and the production of this report and what conversations and actions will follow from that. So with me today, as you said, is fellow parishioner Becky Nicolaides, a prominent historian of labor, community, neighborhood, population change, etc., and a dear friend of many decades. Becky, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. And Gail Kennard, who is head of the Kennard Design Group, whose father, Robert Kennard, was a very distinguished architect here in Southern California. And Gail's also a member of the Cultural Heritage Commission. And it's been a delight to get to know Gail and work with her so closely on this report. Thanks, Gail, for being with us.
Thanks for the invitation. It's always a great opportunity to talk about these issues. So thank you for the invitation.
Of course. And we're joined by my friend, Christopher Hawthorne, the Chief Design Officer for the City of Los Angeles. Christopher was the prime mover in pulling together the working group and leading us, as Mike said, a slightly unwieldy group of many dozens of people who come at the project with all sets of disciplinary and other expertise. And it was Christopher's doing that pulled us together and then helped us to put forward this report. So Christopher, thank you for being with us as well.
Thanks so much, Bill. It's a real pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Terrific. So I'm going to share my screen, which will allow me to, let's see here, oops, that's not quite what I want. Hang on one second, sorry. I promise I'm going to share my screen correctly. Let's see here. Chris, as I pull the screen up, as I figure this out, do you mind just giving us the background to what Mike talked about, the mayor's conversations with you and what got this rolling, and also the timing of this, that this occurred prior to so many of the upheavals that we saw across our country in terms of memorialization and commemoration. What was in the air?
Of course, my pleasure. So let me also echo Bill's thanks to Mike for the invitation. This is precisely the kind of forum and conversation, the ability to share the work and get feedback and frankly guidance from communities all across, not just Los Angeles, but LA County and Southern California, that is really at the center of our recommendations. Our number one recommendation is that we expand and broaden this conversation, and we are actively planning those kinds of conversations. This is one of the first, and it's really a pleasure to be able to share this kind of dialogue with all of you. So thank you in advance for all of your comments and thoughts about what we've done. In terms of the genesis of the project, as some of you will know, I have spent most of my career as a journalist and an architecture critic, and I was at the Los Angeles Times as the architecture critic for about 12 or 13 years. And then the mayor asked me to take on this new role of Chief Design Officer for the city. And when I started in City Hall in early 2018, just about 3 years ago, there was already beginning to be a national conversation about the fate of fraught memorials and monuments, particularly, of course, Confederate monuments across the American South, but also nationally. And Mayor Garcetti, early on in our conversations after I joined his administration, let me know that he was interested in a fuller reckoning or grappling with some particularly difficult moments in LA's history. And he mentioned the 1871 Anti-Chinese Massacre in particular, which remains one of the deadliest lynchings in American history. But more broadly, expressed to me an interest in taking on, joining this national conversation, but in a way, importantly, and this will be significant, I think, for the discussion this morning, in a way that was specifically tailored to Los Angeles and its own particular, in some ways, peculiar relationship with history. So Mike mentioned the fact that we have thought about ourselves as a city of the future. The flip side of that is that we have relied, frankly, on an unusual amount of boosterism and indeed myth-making in forging, particularly our Anglo identity in the late 19th and early 20th century. So what we think of as now as modern Los Angeles. So we have had a difficult and complicated relationship with history that is different from those in other American cities, although of course we have much to learn from the way those conversations have unfolded. So we began thinking about how we could shape a conversation for Los Angeles in Los Angeles that would be productive for Los Angeles and a number of communities. And so we convened in late 2019, the first meeting of this group in City Hall back when we could meet in person. This was in November of 2019. And as you've already heard, it was a group of about 40 historians, architects, indigenous elders, scholars, other cultural leaders, and many of my city colleagues as well. We were lucky to have the city librarian, John Szabo, Michael Holland, the city archivist, Danielle Brazil, the general manager of our Department of Cultural Affairs, who could think of how this work might play out within city government, and then of course others who were thinking about how it may play out in other communities. So we wanted to produce some recommendations. We set the goal of the end of 2020 to finish that work. Bill, you can go to the next slide, I think, as I finish this basic summary. And then of course the world changed in all sorts of ways in 2020. When Kobe Bryant was killed, in fact, in a helicopter crash in January of last year, a kind of organic and really ad hoc memorial emerged around Staples Center. We were really taken by the extent to which mourners there and the creators of that memorial, if you will, really reflected demographically Los Angeles in a really precise way. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and after the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot to grapple with. I think we were helped by having started this work, as Bill said, before the world seemed to turn upside down, and we had a sense of what we wanted to accomplish. And of course, we had to grapple with all of what was happening, but we had a sense of how it might fit into the larger framework of our efforts, I think. And so we set out to produce some very specific policy recommendations, but we always were hopeful that we could have a broader report that would include the kinds of conversations, dialogues, roundtable discussions, photo essays that you've already heard about. And thanks to partnership with the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West, directed by Bill, and support from the Getty Foundation, we were able to really complement those policy recommendations with this other material, which I urge you to read and give us your feedback on. And the final thing I'll say is that we really do think of this as the beginning of the conversation. Our number one recommendation, again, is to take the recommendations and the report more broadly out to communities in a series of conversations that will really, we think, take at least till the end of this year, if not longer. One of those next week, I will give a quick plug for. On Thursday afternoon, we will be convening 4 leading Tongva voices for a conversation about thinking beyond Indigenous land acknowledgements of the type that our report recommends, but also many institutions have been developing, but thinking, I think, Mike, as you were saying, about the broader history of land and the relationship to land and how we have occupied it, and thinking about the ways in which we can support Indigenous communities, particularly Tongva communities, beyond land acknowledgements. And we heard consistently in our conversations with Indigenous elders that while land acknowledgements are important, they risk ringing hollow if they don't also include or point the way toward that really more active reparative work of the kind, Mike, that you talked about. So I encourage you to join us next Thursday. That's an event with USC Dornsife. If you look at the 3rd LA page there, you can find some information on that event, and we're actively planning further conversation.
So where would we find information? Because that's definitely something that I want to attend. Where
absolutely, absolutely. I will add to the chat a link to that information. Absolutely, and we invite all of you to join. It's free and open to the public on Thursday afternoon at noon. I'll add that information to the chat. So that was really the genesis of the project. We think at once that it's among the most comprehensive efforts by any American city to grapple with these questions, but we also proceeded with a great deal of humility. We were proud about the expertise that we brought together in City Hall in that room. but it was just a single room. And we're very much aware of that. And we're very much aware of the need to hear from other voices and hear feedback, guidance on what we've produced. So thanks again for the opportunity to talk with all of you about all those issues.
Thank you, Christopher. Thanks for that great overview. And this slide actually explores some of the great challenges and opportunities that we have, because as Christopher mentioned, that was just a room and here are the streets. And to make policy recommendations is one thing, but also to allow the space for grassroots activity to take place in times of grief or celebration is really one of the great challenges and opportunities here to do something beyond simple guidance about plaques and statues and that sort of thing. That is not what we were after. We're after something entirely different. So I'm going to turn here to Gail, but as I do so, I'm going to go right to our table of contents there. Gail, can you just talk to us about your, this is the table of contents of the activities of the various subcommittees and the roundtables and some of the visual and textual excerpts that we included in the report. Gail, do you want to talk to us about your own work in cultural heritage and how you came to this project, and what part of this table of contents were you involved in?
Yeah, certainly. So there's a number of intersections that I connect with this work. Number one, as you mentioned, I serve on the Cultural Heritage Commission, which is probably the most prominent, one of the most prominent city agencies dealing with history. Although we intersect with cultural affairs and other ways, parks and all that, but that's really our main focus. So I was really interested in collecting information, finding out what other scholars, historians, and civic leaders were thinking about in terms of how we can memorialize our history. So that was one attraction. Number two is,
Gail, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. We're getting a lot of distortion.
Yes.
We're getting a lot of distortion on your audio.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm wondering,
Okay.
so I'm not sure what you just did, but try speaking again.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna.
That's actually better. I don't know what you just did, but that's better.
I
So
think
great.
better?
Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm also the daughter of a Black architect, Robert Kennard. Many people know of Paul Williams, who was probably the most impressive Black architect of Los Angeles, and not only as a Black architect, but nationwide. And Los Angeles has a great history of giving opportunities to African-American architects. So I was very interested in highlighting those contributions. So I bring that. And then thirdly, I'm a native Angelino, and I grew up in Los Angeles. And I realized that the history that was taught to me in the public schools about indigenous people was inaccurate. And I was really interested in finding out a larger truth about the history of the people who originally lived in this place. And so I was also involved with the Indigenous Land Acknowledgement Committee and decolonization. So those are the three things that really brought me to this effort.
Thanks, Gail. Becky, do you want to take up the same question about your involvement and also your work? Your work as an historian.
Yeah. Thank you again. I'm really glad to be here talking about this. So I've been a historian pretty much my entire adult life. And I've written quite a bit about Los Angeles. So I was really just honored to be part of this group. I wanted to just share a little bit. So I was involved with the subcommittee 6, you can see on Bill's share there, which was sites and themes. And I just wanted to share a little bit about what our group did and kind of that process, which I found incredibly creative. And it was really an amazing experience. I mean, to me, this entire working group was a sort of amazing brainstorming session involving all of these folks who came together and just from these really many diverse creative perspectives. And I just had to give a shout out to Christopher and his guidance to the group, which was so sensitive and inclusive. It really kind of brought that energy to the entire enterprise. and really the importance that Christopher and others really emphasized throughout about the importance of community input. When we started convening back in November, Christopher gave us some homework, some readings to do, and some of those readings involved other cities that were involved in this sort of work. And I just remember vividly, I mean, one of the real takeaways that I got from those readings that stuck with me is the importance of a kind of collaborative and community-based approach, and where community members are really enlisted to be part of that process, because when you don't do that, you can have some pretty intense blowback, and it can, you know, derail very well-meaning efforts because people's voices aren't being heard. So I really appreciated that, and the spirit of that was so important through the work of the group. And also sort of the idea that the work of the group is not about being prescriptive, where we're telling everybody what to do and that kind of thing, but really where we're the facilitators of this process rather than the ones kind of dictating how commemoration should look or that kind of thing. That this is a process where we're starting to kick the ball down the road, but I think where the sustaining of that ball's journey is really going to be a group effort that very much involves the community. So just quickly, I just wanted to share a few thoughts about our work on the sites and subcommittee, sites and themes subcommittee. Our assignment was to think about what themes in LA history seem most compelling, and then to brainstorm about how commemoration might look around some of those themes, like how that commemoration could most move and engage people and kind of really have an impact. And it was a really amazing brainstorming process, especially given who was in our group. We had a group of amazing historians, including Bill, but we also had Alex Ross, who's a music critic for The New Yorker, and Yuval Sharon, who's the artistic director of the experimental, very cutting edge opera company called The Industry. And so, you know, we started out, we came up with some themes pretty easily that kind of percolated to the surface. Themes like displacement, which over the centuries has repeated itself, you know, beginning with the indigenous people, and then as colonization unfolded over the centuries, one group kept displacing the next. And then into the 20th century, as LA emerged as an urban metropolitan space, the displacement continued, you know, with neighborhood turnover happening through things like redevelopment or the building of freeways, neighborhoods getting wiped out, this sort of thing. And it's a really powerful thing. I mean, in that process, we could even really see playing out in Pasadena, you know, this process of displacement too. And I think it's a really powerful theme because it really lives on in the people who carry memory of that displacement, but then who can live lives of resilience out of and beyond in the aftermath of that process. So one point that our group made was how important it is to honor those memories and that resilience, and that ought to be a kind of prime objective of commemoration. And we identified other themes like immigration, migration, social justice actions. In many stories of struggle by marginalized people. But I think we also shared a broad sense that it's so important to take an expansive and inclusive view of what historical significance is, like what is historically significant. And just to say a few words about this displacement theme again, which really came up and resonated. That theme raises a key question, which is how do you commemorate displacement, something that's no longer physically there, but it's a kind of absence or erasure? Like, how do you possibly commemorate that? And I think it really demands some creative flexible thinking about commemoration. And so we did some brainstorming around that and thinking about possible modes of commemoration. So we talked about traditional modes, things like, you know, things we're all familiar with, like permanent markers, a statue, a mural, or plaques along a sidewalk, or that kind of thing, which might lend themselves to, you know, like you all, many of you maybe have been to the Freedom Trail in Boston, where you can sort of walk that history. And then, you know, in LA, maybe something like that might exist along important marches like the Chicano Moratorium March. There could be sort of markers along that march, or the 1994 March against Prop 187, things like that. But to me, the more exciting conversations were around more ephemeral modes of commemoration, things like temporary installations, a projection on a wall, a performance, or a bus tour, something like that. And I just want to share one example of how we really dug into thinking about that. And again, tying to the displacement issue. Yuval, the opera director, shared with us his use of projection when he did his opera productions. He did an opera called Sweetland a couple years ago in the LA State Historic Park, which looked at indigeneity in LA. And I just remember him describing how they used projections to sort of evoke what that land looked like, including like deer running through the area. And that was happening right next to the freeway. And I just kind of remember him describing what that might have been like for people driving on the freeway, seeing projections of deer, you know, running across that land. And so he raised that idea of projecting images onto a building or a mural to kind of create an augmented reality, to sort of convey a historical layering about a place through these visuals. And I was so struck by that. And so we kind of took that idea and played with that and thought about imagining some examples of how that might play out. So like one idea our group came up with was to commemorate Charlotta Bass, who was the longtime editor of the California Eagle, which was LA's premier African-American newspaper. And the idea of maybe going to that original building and creating a mural on the side of that building, which is now like an appliance store, but showing, like depicting a window and looking through that imagined window with Charlotta like working at her desk on that space, kind of again, evoking a kind of imaginative way of seeing the past. Or the same concept for the building where the Black Panthers met in South LA, depicting an organizing meeting or that kind of thing. We talked at length too about Chavez Ravine, which was a huge space of displacement where there had been a vibrant Latino community in Chavez Ravine that got pushed out for the building of Dodger Stadium, and how again there could be the use of maybe projecting images along walls or something in Chavez Ravine depicting that original community in a kind of evocative way, and maybe tying that together with an app or something that could be used to kind of explain those stories and kind of lift those stories up of where somebody would be kind of within that space. So those were some of the ideas that came out of our one group, which was one small slice of the creative efforts, I think, of this whole working group. I'll stop. So.
Wow.
Mike, do you have anything to add, or can I pose another question to my panelists?
So just something to jump in, and I'm wondering, because you mentioned Chavez Ravine, and one of the things that occurs to me is I sort of ask the question, well, why does history get suppressed or whitewashed? And some of the big reasons are fear and shame. And I'm interested in sort of how you as a working group have sort of dealt with that, but also like the Dodgers are like an interesting example of, I mean, that's an organization, big organization and big power in Los Angeles, that this may be a story that even though it's out there that they may not want highlighted, and this may go off in a whole different direction, we don't have to answer it, but I'm curious, what has been the response of sort of large organizations like the Dodgers to this process when it involves, stories and history that don't put them in the best light, that may evoke fear and shame?
Christopher, I think
I can jump in on that, Mike. And I did have some conversations with the Dodgers actually ahead of the release of the report. Just we had some briefings for folks to update them on the work we were doing. And the Dodger Stadium stories and Chavez Ravine is a particularly interesting and multi-layered one, because the intermediate step, of course, between that residential community and the construction of Dodger Stadium was a very ambitious social housing plan, which was so ambitious, in fact, that the backlash or the concern or anxiety about it among, let's say, the publisher of my former employer, the Los Angeles Times, and other civic leaders was so significant that it actually led to a change of mayoral administration in Los Angeles. And as a result, the end of what was a relatively brief moment of experimentation in terms of building much more social housing in Los Angeles, which is something that, as a result of that shift, we have very little of compared to other American cities. So there are any of these sites that you begin to look into, you find a remarkable number of layers. But to answer your question more directly, we have found that many of the institutions that are mentioned in the report are actually have begun, many of them as a result of the larger reckonings of last year, to begin to do this work. And so they're actually, rather than being defensive or having any negative reaction, they're quite interested in speaking with us about how this might help them do similar work. So we're quite encouraged by that.
That's great. And then just real quick, also want to introduce, bring into the conversation, Steve Williams is here. Steve is a member of the vestry here at All Saints Church. He's a documentary filmmaker, and he's also the co-convener of our Telling the Whole Story group on the stained glass windows. And so, Steve, feel free to jump in also at any time. And then also for all of you who are out there, you can text in your questions to, and I just lost the number. Here we go, to 910 text ASC, 910 text ASC, which is 910-839-8272, 910-839-8272. Or if you're on Facebook, just leave them in the comments. So, okay, Bill, back to you. Or Steve, go ahead.
Steve, go right ahead.
I want to throw a question. Unless I can wait to the end also, Bill, if you want to go.
No, Steve, please feel free.
Okay. One of the things, and this is such a fabulous thing, and I've spent days on this, and Becky's work also has been really fascinating. One of the things I want to ask about, though, is that as historians, and obviously this distinguished committee that's here right now and what the city is doing, we're fortunate we live in Los Angeles, but this trend that is basically going on this quote racial critical theory, this wave of endangering, I think, putting historians like yourself in the city of Los Angeles and in the opposite side of the thing of erasing the past, this controversy with the 1619 Project and the laws that are being passed in these states that will not allow discussions on subjects such as these in school, when we know that education is really a primary issue for really correcting a lot of this. I just wanted to get your opinion on that and how this massive project that LA is undertaking is such a groundbreaker. Yeah.
Well, I can offer some thoughts, and I'd invite my fellow panelists to offer some as well. So speaking perhaps more personally and professionally from where I sit as a historian, what was particularly exciting and even thrilling about this work was to contemplate the public sphere and the public realm and our obligations to it as places where education can take place beyond the walls of a classroom, beyond the pages of a textbook, that moving throughout our shared public spaces in Southern California or Greater Los Angeles presents all kinds of opportunities to teach, particularly young people from where I sit, but all of us, to teach about the past and to show that the past is alive and constantly being reinterpreted. And so that kind of energy that is the opposite of erasure, in fact, it's driven by a commitment to more history, more interpretation, more reckoning, is especially thrilling to me. And I can feel with this publication of this report, it feels palpable to me that this is starting to happen in really exciting ways. Gail, do you have thoughts on this?
I do. Thank you, Bill. I think what's important, and the significance of this work is that we're looking at how to redefine ourselves as a city and as a region. And there's a lot of talk about selective forgetting. And that we have to understand that the narratives that we've all grown up with are not the whole story, like what you're doing at the church, telling the whole story. This is difficult because it threatens power structures. It threatens our identities. For example, if you say you're an American, your image says that you're a Caucasian, you're a white person, right? And the rest of us, we're hyphenated. We're African American, we're Latinx, we're Asian American. So that in itself is a problem, right? Because all of us built this place. All of us did. The labor, the sacrifice, the blood, the Charlotte Bass, all the people that we know about and that we're learning about, and a lot of the people that we've lost to history. We all built this place. We all have ownership. The indigenous people are not past. They're here. Los Angeles has one of the largest populations of indigenous people in the country. So we've got to reckon with that. And again, I think the faith communities can really do an amazing job of this because it's about more than setting the record straight, telling all the different histories. It's about who we are as human beings and valuing all of us. And I really call on you, I commend you for holding this forum to start to talk about that. Because if we don't value all of us, we all lose. We all lose. And we're all either triumphant, or as I like to say, we're traumatized. We're at the receiving end of trauma. So that's not going to work going forward. It's not sustainable.
Becky or Christopher? Becky?
Wow, thank you.
Well, back to Steve's question, I feel like that backlash you described is very, very much part of our polarized politics right now. And, when I think about myself as a historian, my education, I was in graduate school in the 90s and learning about the corpus of work that historians have done over the last, let's say, 50 years. I'd say for that amount of time, historians have been telling pretty inclusive histories. It started with social history and the lifting up of a lot of, really amazing scholarship around things like slavery, Reconstruction, telling a more inclusive type of history. That, I think, Bill, I don't know if you'd agree, but I think that's been like pretty sustained, since the 60s, 70s and beyond. I mean, that's sort of what we as historians are that is our kind of knowledge base in a way. Now, the extent to which that's trickled into the mainstream, into K through 12 education, that kind of thing, that's been spotty. It's varied. It has to do, I think, with localities wanting to hear that inclusive history or not, or hearing a more triumphalist, narrative of that other type of history. So it just, I do feel like, history, like many things in the days that we've been living in, have been so politicized, and it's unfortunate in a way. But just one other thought, even within our field, when we look at things, I work quite a bit on Survey LA, which was another initiative that LA City had launched. And that's around historic preservation and how we, that's a kind of another commemoration approach in a sense, like what buildings do we deem worthy of designating as historically significant to be preserved and that kind of thing. And even, the tradition of that has not been the most inclusive vision in that mode as well. So I think even in that arena, like that kind of needs some shaking up as well, I think, so that there's a little more inclusivity and breadth in terms of what we deem historically significant in a sense. So there's room for improvement, I think, in a lot of areas, but I think on some level, we are wading a little bit into the, the politics of this, which can be pretty intense and fraught sometimes.
As a public official, Christopher, I mean, it's a particularly difficult place to straddle, yeah?
Well, we knew, given, and that's a really important question, thank you for it. We knew that this work would be scrutinized along the lines that you're talking about. So we thought it was important not to be prescriptive, not to be doctrinaire, but also to be rigorous about the history. So we wanted, again, to value expertise. We wanted to define expertise broadly, and we also wanted to understand the limits of our work, what it included and where it stopped. And I'll give you a precise example of that. The work on Indigenous land acknowledgement policy, we thought it was important to articulate support for that kind of a policy to come out of the mayor's office and the city, and to say why that was important, and to point to models around the country where institutions or cities had done that work in a way we thought was effective, equitable, inclusive. But we didn't want to write the language. It's not our job to write the language of that acknowledgement. It's the job now, and the next step is to work with our Native American Indian Commission, which is a rare city county joint body, and Indigenous leaders to actually produce that language. And so we carefully defined, where we took the work and then where we hand off the work, and we want to be very clear about that. So it was important not to be doctrinaire, also in tone. That was very important in terms of the scrutiny we knew we would be getting. So if you read the report carefully, you'll find that it sometimes disagrees with itself, or we give people room to criticize the city, to criticize the work that we have done in various city departments and agencies. And we thought that kind of contested nature of the report, as long as it's productive and collegial, was important. And we hope that gives us, that we enter that conversation from a slightly different position than perhaps other cities have, who have really tried to do this work in a way that was more specific. And there are, of course, a lot of minefields in that sense. So we try to be thoughtful about that from the beginning.
Yeah. I want to drift back to something that Becky was talking about. Steve, did you have any follow-up to the responses?
Well, it's something you can do towards the end, and ultimately is that issue of when you talk about Chavez Ravine and you talk about pointing out these and celebrating some of the struggles and the things that really were the petri dish that made us, is that issue of the cost to the people that have put the labor in, which is reparations. Right. And is there going to be a discussion about that? Because I look at the community at Chavez Ravine and seeing that if they had stayed there, the value of what that land would be to them today, which was taken away for the city of Los Angeles entertainment value, is huge. And is that something, I'm saying you can't point it out without saying the loss in that sort of situation. So that's my follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in terms of the productivity and generative qualities of this report, nothing will please us more than to see conversations now ensue that could lead to policy or lead to decision-making that is jointly done with the communities and people in institutions in positions of power.
And just a really quick thought on that, Bill. I think that's a really important follow-up. In terms of where the work is already proceeding, the mayor did very specifically endorse a memorial for the victims of the 1871 Anti-Chinese Massacre in his State of the City address. And that work is moving forward with the Chinese American Museum and other leaders of the Chinese American community. The next step is to identify a site for that memorial. This work and the approach and the tone that we talked about, and the emphasis on process and community input, is already guiding the conversations we're having in the city about what COVID-19 memorials might look like. And I would say, in a broader sense, the mayor's State of the City address this year touched heavily on these issues of commemoration and reparation. So we will now be investing in a reparations commission at the city level. And he talked explicitly about redlining and the connections between histories of redlining and our our current housing policy. So there are already some very specific ways in which these recommendations, and I think the broader approach, are beginning to both look at very specific memorials like 1871 and a broader conversation about reparation, which, as you point out, is really the most important next step.
And it's
Thank you.
especially, it's exciting because all of it's exciting and past due, as we called the report. But you look at the deep dive that the collective group of us with our collaborators elsewhere as well took into our regional history, and it's hundreds of years of contemplation. But now with the report release, there's a certain velocity and urgency. So, you know, the 150th anniversary of the Anti-Chinese Massacre is 5 months from now. And in those 5 months, given the mayor's endorsement of a thoughtful commemorative installation, things are going to change. And so it's fun to be part of this and see things move quickly now. So I just wanted to ask Gail, when Becky was speaking about the various ways in which the Sites and Themes Committee thought of the vernacular or the ephemeral ways in which we might think about memorialization and commemoration within communities beyond the semi-permanence of statues or plaques. Are you seeing more of that kind of work coming out of cultural heritage now, that there's all kinds of ways in which the past can be marked and memorialized and thought about?
Yes, the answer is definitely yes. And we're grappling with this because the ordinance that we're laboring under and the whole context in which we've been working is we value architectural significance over cultural significance. So we've got to figure out a way to tell those stories that cannot be told in an architectural structure. That's what we're starting to grapple with now. And I'm really encouraged. We had a very productive meeting last week, actually, with some people who are into augmented reality. They're consultants in doing that. So how can we tell these stories that, as Becky said, are not physically represented in a structure? So that's really, really encouraging that we're trying to do that because the number of monuments that recognize the contributions of people of color in Los Angeles is very small. It's like 5 or 6%. It's very small, and that's everybody: African American, Latino, Asian. And part of the problem is the structures that tell those stories are not monumental, so to speak. So yes, we're working on that.
Yeah, thank you. Christopher, when you pulled us all together, did you allow yourself to think about the ways in which some of these commemorative acts would or could take place beyond statuary and plaques?
Well, I wonder if you might show, do you have an image of the Endeavor parade? Is that in your collection? If you can pull that up, I was thinking about that image because this is also about how we share our triumphs and how we celebrate the ways in which Los Angeles has brought particular kinds of meaning to the world. We're going through this. I'm
going to go through it quickly. We can always go back.
So if you go back to exactly. So we thought a lot about about this specific relationship of Los Angeles to civic memory and the notion of how we think about our past. And there are ways in which we have always understood Los Angeles through motion, through mobility, through movement. And we think there are maybe ways to commemorate Los Angeles through movement, through ephemeral or temporary or mobile celebrations. And to me, there were some fantastic examples of how powerful that could be over the last decade. Think of the Michael Heiser levitated mass rock structure coming through the streets of Los Angeles, a kind of slow motion parade that drew big crowds. And then this, which was even, I took one of my daughters out to stand on the sidewalk to watch the Endeavor go by, and it was remarkable. It was this idea that we had sent innovation and this idea of aerospace ingenuity in greater Los Angeles out to the world, and we are now bringing that back into the heart of Los Angeles. So this space shuttle flew on the back of a 747 to LAX, as many of you will recall, and then there was a parade through the streets of Los Angeles to take it to Exposition Park, where it's now on display. And that to me was a very Los Angeles kind of commemoration and way of thinking about and celebrating, which is also part of this. There's reckoning and reparative work, absolutely. There's also celebrating what makes Los Angeles, Los Angeles. And this to me is one of the great examples of how that works that is really unique to LA. You wouldn't have an event that had this kind of meaning in another city. And there's a great kind of history of scholarship about thinking about the ways in which the city becomes legible through movement that we really think should inform our thoughts about commemoration as we move ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. And your phrase, what makes LA LA, reminds me that our fellow committee member, Professor Eric Avila from UCLA, cautioned us at the very early deliberations of our committee that grappling with history, personal, institutional, regional, etc., is something that many in Angelino for a long time has come here to escape. In other words, a land of reinvention, a land of rejuvenation, a land to look to the future deliberately and perhaps not engage so strongly with a personal or institutional or regional past. And so that's another fine line of this. We have to respect that in the culture, as we are also urging people, no, let's have a real reckoning with our past as well. So it makes the report all the more, well, I guess, fertile for further conversations. Mike, do you have questions for us?
Yeah, we do. We've got
more images too.
Yeah, we've got some questions that are coming in. First, a couple people have brought up sort of looking at children and students. Someone saying about the website, is there, or just sort of the presentation, can we have something that would have a kid-friendly portion so that students could take field trips and learn the story not taught, and even sort of like online, but also as we're thinking about the the commemorations and how we're going to bring this history to life, can we make sure that we're doing it for all generations? And then someone else texted in, please speak to elementary teachers, especially 3rd and 4th grades. Many of us have been teaching the real stories as we've learned them for many years. I think educators are generally open and definitely do not rely on textbook material. And so I guess that would be my first thing, which is as you're looking at presenting this, it seems to be a daunting task just to begin with. And then you have to think about presenting it across a variety of cultures and also across a variety of generations. And so can you sort of talk about what thought has gone into that, of presenting this for different generations?
Chris, I can pick that up in terms of the K through 5 educational communities. So those absolutely indispensable 4th grade teachers of California history, that's a community that I'm privileged to work with through the work we do across the educational spectrum with kids, teachers, on up through the high school, collegiate, and postgraduate communities. And I think that's absolutely right, that the 4th grade teachers have been, in the last, I would say 30 years, about the same timetable that Becky talked about, have been teaching a very different kind of California history to those 10-year-olds. And I think this work, again, to go back to something I said a few minutes ago, this work allows what is innovative in the classroom and discussion-based with those 10-year-olds who are fascinated with their neighborhoods and the history of California and their families' arrivals here, et cetera. It allows that work to go outdoors and to continue that kind of investigation and understanding of the past that is anything but boring. I mean, commemoration and memorialization are not boring exercises. They're who we are and who we decide to be and what stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And to have the 10-year-olds make contributions to that is absolutely critical, because they're the ones who will inherit these dialogues as we move forward in time. And there's no question that curricular innovations can take place through, when the world returns to more normal, through field trip activities into these sites, many of which are called out in our report, and others that the kids in the neighborhood will know more than we would. They'll know the histories of their neighborhood. They'll know critical sites and spots. And so looking to those places and try to wring historical meaning from them is part and parcel to the reception of this report we'd like to have happen. So Becky?
Yeah, I just wanted to add too that I feel like we talked about this a little bit in our group. I feel like there's a really amazing role that kids could play in helping tell this history too. Oral history, for example, is such a powerful, interesting tool and way to learn about the past and document the past. And I think we had talked about imagining, kids, students of all, beginning fairly young and on through high school, college level, create, doing oral histories, interviewing their family, their neighbors about the place, their spaces, to kind of bring up this history, and they become the kind of documenters of this history as well. I mean, that is a truly sort of grassroots approach to kind of telling these stories of place and of what these areas, what they mean. And so I could imagine students just being part of the generative process of kind of creating these histories as well.
Yeah, thank you. Christopher?
I was just going to say quickly, this is exactly the kind of suggestion that we're hoping to get. And I love the idea of having, we could have a tab on the website of this material that has been tailored for the classroom for that kind of discussion. And we have so many people in the group who could help us think about which material might be best suited for that kind of classroom discussion. So that's a fantastic idea.
Gail?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, one of the recommendations also was to do training for city staff. And all those folks that are engaged with these issues, which is basically everyone, that they have retraining, because those of us who haven't been in fourth grade in the last 30 years, we need refresher. We need to figure out what's current. What are the historians telling us now? So that was one of the recommendations that I hope will have an impact.
Oh, fantastic. So another question. So as part of what we're trying to do as we do this work here is also approach it from a trauma-informed perspective. And one of the things that we are learning is that when we share our stories, especially stories that have been traumatic, it's sort of a double-edged sword, because there's ways of that you need to share the story to heal, and it's also re-traumatizing to do that. And so these stories, as I'm sure you have discovered and are discovering, are not devoid of feeling and emotion. And so Elizabeth asks this question. She says, have you created any space for not so collegial dialogue spaces, places where truth, pain, trauma can be discussed or anger can be expressed?
That's such a great question. Christopher, do you mind if I take that one first? So I was fortunate in my role in the committee to sit and help moderate a discussion on the historical legacies and continued conversations that we have about Father Junipero Serra. And we gathered together a small but quite representative group of thoughtful, very thoughtful people to address that legacy from their particular perspective in their particular community. And it was a hard and fascinating discussion that did, as Elizabeth asks, provoked disagreement and pain and trauma on the part of many of those present. And then as we wrapped up, which was across two of these roundtable discussions, long ones, it is certainly not that everyone agreed, but everyone agreed that talking about and addressing this issue through the life of the single individual and his role in California history was a critical conversation that we in the 21st century have to have with the 18th century. And so I think the answer is yes, that at least in the small aspect of this work, some of that space was absolutely not only allowed for, but called for.
It also seems to me this is an opportunity for faith communities, because what needs to happen for what Elizabeth is talking about is there needs to be a space that is safe enough for people to feel and safe enough for people to be brave. And that could potentially be a role for a church like All Saints Church to say, you know what, we're going to look at this report and we know that it's going to be hard. And we're going to try to be with our own history as well as the role that we play in this, be a space where that trauma healing and that trauma expression can happen. And I wonder if that's something that we can sort of work on together because there's really good models for trauma healing out there. is, how can, because really you've created a great report, but your job was never to run with it. That's our job, as a city, is to say, what are we going to do with it? And so I really sort of wonder, maybe that's a role that we can play. We've got about 5 more minutes. Steve, I want to jump to you and say, do you have any other questions or thoughts?
No, this has been fantastic, and I hope there's a opportunity for follow-up and continued communications. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I was really struck, Bill, and thank you, Steve. You said it was Eric Avila, who is that who you were talking about, Bill?
Professor Eric Avila.
Right, and he said, I tried to write this down as you were saying, said grappling with history is something many Angelinos came here to escape, and sort of this idea that this is a place where you come to reinvent yourself. Whenever we tell stories like this, like we're going to have this happen at All Saints Church, where people will say, well, this isn't why I come to church. I don't come to church to do this work. And that may be true. How did you engage this? How do you engage people who aren't interested in engaging?
That is a hard question, Mike.
Yeah.
Everybody has a story.
Yeah.
And everybody's story is filled with truths and lesser truths. And so I guess the connection is at the fundamentally human level, and unpacking and unpeeling those stories, and then providing, in terms of the perspective of a scholar, then providing the broader context, the stories of the many as against the stories of the few. And so I don't really know how to answer that other than to say teaching. Teaching is how you do that, I think.
I have a quick thought on that, because this work and how we thought about it has already really shaped some of the other projects that I'm working on in the mayor's office in ways that are connected to this important question. So first of all, I just want to thank members of the group like Professor Avila, who really emphasized that paradox. And then also, it was really Danielle Brazil, the general manager of our Department of Cultural Affairs, and Rostin Wu, the artist and designer, who really compelled us to think about process very carefully at the beginning and think about what these conversations would look like that would move the work forward, and really talk about that at the outset. But I think it's really about opening up space for people to talk about the aspirations for their own communities. And so the initiative I'm thinking about is we're doing some work on trying to break the logjam in the conversation about the future of single family neighborhoods and housing production, and looking at histories of redlining, for example, and grappling with reparative work that might be necessary there. And those are very difficult conversations that many folks are not particularly interested in engaging in. We have found in doing that work, we're doing a larger design challenge to produce some new architectural ideas about housing options that might be more in line with people's needs. And I think COVID really clarified this distinction between overcrowding, the fact that we have communities that were really hard hit by COVID are most overcrowded in terms of housing. We did a lot of community engagement before we even produced a brief for this initiative. And I mention it because we started by asking people, not what you think about this proposed legislation related to housing or that proposed legislation, but how you would like to see your own community evolve, how you would like to see it grow. What would you like to protect? What would you like to bring back that used to be there that is no longer there? What would you like to add that you don't have, that you think you need or your neighbors need? And that was a very productive way to start. And so it's thinking about the framing and how you bring people into a conversation that is about their own autonomy, their own community's autonomy, and giving folks a genuine sense of self-determination, part of that conversation. So we have learned a lot. And I just want to also thank you for that suggestion that you be involved in carrying this work forward. I think particularly in terms of thinking very carefully about the trauma question, we really look to people like you who have been doing this work and can give us the benefit of your expertise about the best way to organize those conversations.
Thank you. We've got about 1 minute. I want to just read something that was put in the chat, which I think is we'll just leave the question out there, which is stories can make us captives to the moment instead of available for the moment. I think it's really interesting. How do we create stories that empower our being available for the moment? we've got about 1 minute left, and I'd just love to sort of just really quick hits. What counsel do you have for us as All Saints Church as we start to dip our toe in the water of doing this work that is past due, of telling the whole story of these pieces of our history?
Well, listening is critical. Don't be in too big of a hurry. Be open to things that you never even considered and that are perhaps buried or need to be excavated. Try to understand the moment at which this or that happened. So when this stained glass went in, why? What was happening at that moment, as opposed to perhaps what's being illustrated in the glass itself. And always seek alternative opinions and points of view.
Others? Gail, Christopher?
Gail, you and Becky go next.
No, I think what Bill said was actually right on point. It's so important, again, to the issue of how we value each other. Just having someone listen and validating that I understand you, I hear you, I see you, that is so valuable. So I encourage you to do that.
I would just echo a lot of what Bill just said, kind of keeping an open space and framework for getting people's, getting those multiple voices in. And I would suggest too, I think for All Saints, if possible, to kind of open that up a little to the broader community in a sense. Voices beyond the church. I'm not sure how that would happen or how that would work itself out, but I think that that could also help create a fuller sort of story of the history of the church and its place in Pasadena and the community.
Well, Chris, you got a final word for us?
Well, let me say again, thank you so much for having us. And my final comment is connected to that great point in the chat about, the present day. We have our own biases, and we shouldn't presume that we somehow have some enlightened perspective on the past that all other generations have lacked. And members of our committee really did continue to caution us about that memorials, which, as Bill was saying, seek to commemorate something in the past, are often expressing the values of the present most directly of all. And we have to be very careful about understanding that we have our own tendency to do that now.
Thank you all. This has been phenomenal. I guarantee you we're going to have you back as this work continues. As I said, the hour went by incredibly fast, and I wish we had more time. And I'm so grateful for the gift that you all gave us. Gail, Bill, Becky, Christopher, Steve, thank you so much for being here. And let's just keep the conversation going.